Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, which is a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Eddie Boon. I'm here in East London, where I'm based, serving the Thames North Synod of the United Reformed Church as discipleship enabler. It's a privilege to be the host of the podcast for this season and to share in some really great and fascinating conversations which we have week by week. And we do hope that this conversation will be useful to you in your preaching ministry. On to introduce today's guests. Today's guest is Andy Flannagan. Welcome, Andy.
Hi there. Hi, Eddie.
Andy Flanagan's album Drowning in the Shallow was described as near perfect by Cross Rhythms, but he remains disappointedly imperfect. He wrote the critically acclaimed book, Those Who Show Up, and this book has inspired many people to get involved in politics, and he is now the executive director of Christians in Politics, longing to see the church invest as much in the dispersed as it is in the gathered. He is leading on releasing and equipping Christians to be influential in the spheres of culture for the Gather UK movement. His songs We Seek Your Kingdom and Tears of Celebration have been taking words of worship beyond the sanctuary into the civic space and gleaning huge use around the UK and beyond. He is now helping to coordinate the Boundless collective, which is songs by UK songwriters with the whole of life, not just Sundays in mind. His worlds collided perfectly in 2022 when leading worship at the now, he's written infamous, but I'd like to say famous National Prayer Breakfast that precipitated a change in government. It's great to have you with us, Andy. And introducing today's JPIT member, joining us today from the Joint Public Issues team is Rue Stewart, who is the head of public issues for the United Reformed Church. Welcome, Rue.
Hi everyone, good to see you.
So, before we go into a bit more detail about some things that are going on in today's uh, world situation and then dig into the text, how do you see politics and the pulpit and preaching ministry and worship, perhaps in general, Andy, relating to the stuff of everyday life in politics?
It's funny, as with most questions, I think we are on the firmest foundation when we just mostly talk about Jesus. And quite often with my role, Christians in Politics, I'll be speaking at an event or a conference or a festival, and folks will come up to me at the end of the talk and say, "Oh, Andy, that was really interesting. You've convinced me that Jesus actually cares about politics. You've convinced me that the civic leaders were actually the same people as the religious leaders. There wasn't that separation of church and state. So in first century Palestine, there was that connection. The civic center was more like the temple was more like a civic center rather than just a place of worship. And therefore there's an integration, mind, body, and spirit in the Hebrew mindset were integrated. And so people wouldn't have understood this separation that we seem to have between, I guess some of it goes back to misrepresenting Jesus when he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. And we think, oh, great, render unto Caesar what is Caesar. Let Caesar look after all the broadband and the bins and the taxation and render unto God what is God's, and God will be in charge of the prayers, hymns, and invisible things, the Sunday morning things, And but actually, there's no way that somebody in first century Palestine would have heard Jesus' words in that way. When Jesus was saying, "Render unto Caesar, what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's," I could draw the Venn diagram more accurately like this. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. That Caesar has this small amount of delegated authority in the context of God's overall authority. So when you think about Jesus speaking into politics, people will say, "Oh, you've convinced me. You've convinced me that he was political, but you haven't convinced me that he was a politician. So therefore, we shouldn't become politicians and we shouldn't get involved." And depending on how well I know the people, I'll then often, depending how cheeky I'm feeling at that point, I'll say, "You're right. He wasn't a politician, but he also wasn't an accountant or an airline pilot. So are you seriously telling me that carpentry is the only career option open to believers?" That's
Yeah.
that that specificity of following is maybe not what we're looking at. But if you're looking at the God of the underdog, who all through Scripture has intentionally chosen the side of the underdog, then the last thing you do when you're incarnated into humanity is to come as a political leader. You have to show that your kingdom is made of different stuff. And so it's not surprising that Jesus wasn't a politician, but I don't think it then follows that we shouldn't be then politically engaged. I think we have that Genesis 1 call to be imaging his rule and reign, that call from right back at the start of everything, made in the image of God, to be stewarding all of creation, human and non-human creation. That call is very clearly on us. And so to draw a line and say, we shouldn't be political seems nonsensical to me.
Oh, that's really helpful, that angle. And of course, that question that you raised about Jesus not being this or Jesus not being that is a particularly tricky question for ordained ministers, of course, and religious leaders, about how they see, their discipleship with Jesus. That's really helpful. Thank you, Andy. Let's add a little bit of context, shall we? There has been possibility of a pause, at least now at the time of recording this podcast. There was recently the situation of the estimated 50,000 people who suddenly descended on the Spanish enclave of Ceuta last week. Our Prime Minister also reiterated the need to tackle small boat crossings following that, and for safe routes for immigration. There was a deadly protests continuing in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, where elections are taking place. There was a Ukraine drone strike on the consumer warehouse, Wildberries, which I think is the Russian equivalent of Amazon, isn't it? East of Moscow. And more positively, perhaps, the Commonwealth Games recently came to an end in Glasgow. So there's a few things that are currently going around in the news. On the 12th of August, there's UN International Youth Day, where it's always good to highlight the contribution of young adults and young people to society. And there may be more that you know about as you're preparing for your own preaching. So with that in mind, I'm going to highlight the text which we have, which is taken from the lectionary. These will all be found in the bio of the podcast, the verses, but we've got before us Genesis 45, we've got Psalm 133, we've got Romans 11, and we've got Matthew 15. And then there are two additional readings which are offered, should you wish, from Isaiah 56 and Psalm 67. So perhaps we could dig into some of these and consider some of them, maybe in the order that you've got them. We'll see where we go with this conversation. Genesis 45 verses 1 to 15. This unveiling of Joseph and his provision for his family from his new position of power in Egypt. Andy, what do you make? What do you make of this? And
Well,
how can this?
it's really interesting that our theme is politics in the pulpit, and that you're describing this as an unveiling, Eddie, because I think one of the things with the various church leaders who are involved with Christians in politics, many of whom are actually members of political parties, they often talk about that tension of being a local church leader, but also being very passionate about politics. And it often comes with studying theology, because it's impossible to study theology. It's impossible to stare at scripture for very long without thinking, actually, there are some implications that God cares about how society is ordered. Look at Jubilee, look at Sabbath, look at the New Testament church. It's impossible to stare at scripture for any length of time and not think, actually, this has implications for how we live. And so often church leaders do want to get political, and they should get political. But they often feel a little bit guilty about influencing. They see themselves as, influencing their congregants. And I think what strikes me here, looking at this story of Joseph, this unveiling you describe, or this, and as you said, he's stepping into this place of power. It's almost like a church leader stepping into that place of power, realizing, well, I've got different colored clothes. I get to stand probably up above people once a week and say what I think. But actually, what we've seen be really effective for church leaders is actually church leaders being honest about the fact that they are members of political parties. Actually, because then they are interrogable for what they share. Because the truth is, we're all passionate about the political views that we hold. We're passionate about what we believe about society. And so even if you think you're hiding it, the truth is you're probably not hiding it. And actually, it's far better to be honest and say something and put in an article where you've sourced material from, because actually then you can disciple your people into the realm of politics. If a church leader stays neutral and tries to be quiet and tries to be silent and tries to be hidden about what they think, that means inevitably their people are going to be hidden and quiet and silent about their political engagement as well, are not going to feel free, are not going to feel empowered to step into that mission field. And the most important job for any local church leader is to be actually inspiring and empowering their people to be going into that mission field of politics, supporting them when they're there, understanding it's a tough place, understanding they're going to need some support, some pastoral support, some practical support. But it means that you can call people to be standing alongside those people for whom their mission field is politics. And, I think one of the things that screams out at me when we think about politics in the pulpit, too often we're thinking of the pulpit and we're thinking of that rather strange model of just one man, and it often sadly is just one man leading a church, when actually the biblical picture of leadership within the church is much more collegiate, much more of a sense of team. And that means when you do spend time looking at a subject, say we're looking at climate, say we're looking at immigration, as you've just mentioned, Eddie, then actually, if there are folks involved in a team in leading a congregation, you probably will have a spread of opinion. And maybe we can have 5 minutes from that person and 5 minutes from that person and 5 minutes from that person. And suddenly you can be political without it all having to hinge on, yes, but what does the vicar think? Or what does the leader think? Or what does the minister think? And so I think, I guess, sorry, you got me on my soapbox, but I think some really key issues are brought up by this sense of this kind of realization of power, but how do we use that well rather than hide away and hide behind it?
Yeah, that's really a couple of things came to mind before I was through. Firstly, the old thing from your maths teacher, show you're working, and here Joseph almost shows the working about how he got to this position, and they're relating that to what you say about being visible and being willing to stand up and be counted and show up, as your book describes it. People turned off if you just say this is what we should think and do and believe, but they are inspired when you explain the reasons. But
you can actually disciple people, bring
yeah,
people into the journey rather than just saying, well, here it is. Do you like it or do you not? That's the consumerist model of church.
and then obviously this dilemma, will come to it in the other passages as well, but this dilemma between how you deal with those closest to you, like your family and kinship, and how you deal with others wider afield, because everyone suffered from this famine. What about you, Rue? Genesis 45, how does it inspire you?
Yeah, well, it's one of those ones. It's a passage that lots of people who have been at church for any length of time will know. We've heard this. If you've been to Sunday school as a kid, this will be one of those ones. If you've been to see Andrew Lloyd Webber's musicals, this will be familiar. There's a great familiarity to this text for many people who might be coming to our churches on Sunday. So for me, it was like, what can I offer to this that perhaps is a slightly different way of looking at it than what we often do? I think for me, I shudder a little bit now, but probably back in my younger days, I would have thought, that idea of you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Thinking like, just suffer the hard things that are happening to you. Don't worry, God's going to make it all good in the end. And I think that's all very well in the end, but it's not very good whenever you're in the middle of it. And so the idea of preaching to our congregation, just suffer, just suffer willingly at the minute, because God's going to bring it all right in the end. I think the lived reality for lots of people in our congregations will be quite different. It's not going to be that a major sense of hope. There's going to be that sense of, I need to know that God's with me now. It's not just about looking for what's coming in the future. And so I was thinking around that, and I was thinking, what are the signs of God working around in us now? I didn't quite get to a conclusion on that. I was also thinking about just that existential threat and dread. I was really going into some of the depths here, some of the major kind of panic, thinking about these folks who had just come cap in hand, I suppose, is the old phrase that we would have had, looking for salvation from this great superpower because they had run out of money, they had nothing, and they came in search of hope and in search of help. And perhaps, they were hoping to bargain or trade, and then they were willingly offered something that was this exuberant abundance, this unexpected haha moment, this great moment of revelation, and salvation, and God certainly working things out for their good, in ways perhaps that they didn't deserve, that they hadn't earned. And so there's so many different ways we could take that very familiar messages from Scripture that would be an inspiration and a help perhaps to our congregations. So I was thinking about that, and also thinking about the existential threat that people groups around the world might face. So if you've got intercessions, this might be a bouncing off point to think about groups in the world now that do feel that sort of existential dread and threat, thinking about Jewish people now, thinking about Palestinians now, thinking about other places in the world where there's great conflict and so on. So I was thinking about bouncing off points there. But the last thing that I hit on, which really gave me a sense of, oh, that's really nice, for me, was getting into verse 13. You must tell my father, this is Joseph speaking, how greatly I am honored in Egypt. And I was thinking, here's this immigrant, this person who was a slave, who was brought into the country, who worked his way up, who was a prisoner, who had been falsely accused, but had a gift, had a talent, and that was recognized, and he was given great authority and great honor in the country. And that hit home for me, just how important it is that we are honoring of people who come from different countries to the UK, and the blessing that they can bring. And I was thinking very much about, how many in our congregations do come from other countries. Certainly where I am at in London, we've got a very diverse a population, very diverse congregation as well. And it's that idea of welcoming people who have often felt estranged and felt like strangers, and saying, are you honored here? Do you feel honored here? Are you able to show your talents and your gifts, even in this church? Or do you feel there's barriers because of where you've come from? But that idea of how do we honor the people who have come from somewhere else, and allow them to flourish and to use the gifts that they have on offer. That for me was just a real message of hope, actually, and a challenge for me as well. How can I exhibit that same kind of sense that I'm feeling in the passage, and make sure that those of us in our churches feel that welcomed and that honored as well?
Thank you. Not making assumptions and allowing people, if you like, to do their job. Well, so it's quite a beautiful ending to this passage, isn't it? It's quite emotional, really. And I think we've been tracking some of these Genesis passages over the last few weeks in this podcast, and the narrative about Jacob and then the sons is sort of littered with quite a bit of dysfunctionalism and favoritism and mess ups and regrets and all that sort of thing. But there's the real sense of, as I said, love and kinship when they are reunited here, wept upon them and
Yeah.
kiss them all.
And you might add it just to drop in I guess the liturgical thought of how important this is for us to include those emotions in our liturgy. That it's really clear in Scripture that God's not shy of our emotions. Yet we are, especially those of us who have been brought up in the United Kingdom, there is such a proper sense of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and so often we can be so formal and so hiding away of our emotions when actually, as Rue said, there are some horrendous things going on in people's lives, whether that's illness, whether that's the fear in and around climate stuff, whether that's some folks with families who are really suffering in the war zones of the world. People are facing some incredible stuff, and if we don't allow the space for that anger, that doubt, and that disappointment to be expressed in our places of worship, people will find other ways of expressing it, especially our teenagers. If we don't allow the space for our teenagers to express their anger, their doubt, their disappointment in the context of worship, they will find other ways of expressing it in ways that will probably make us less happy.
Yeah,
So I think it is incumbent on us as we think, as we lead congregations, as we curate services and experiences for folks. How are we allowing people to express where they're at, or
yeah,
are we just telling people how to feel and what to say?
yeah,
Are we allowing that participatory nature in the liturgy and in the conversation and in the prayer, or are we just prescribing how people should
mm,
feel? And the Psalms provide a wonderful framework for that, but so often we fight shy of actually embracing the depth
yeah.
of the emotion involved.
Yeah, we'll look at the psalm just in a moment. It's a reminder that in that Genesis passage we've got this, rock bottom poverty, and it's real poverty rather than relative poverty in terms of how sociologists look at today. But then
Mm.
there is this joyful emotional thing, and hearing about the Boundless project, Andy, and trying to be more real about. And I think him songwriters have always tried to do this, and there's the sense of lament and things, but it's just something that people have found difficult, haven't they? Because and whether they thought, oh, well, people don't want this in their worship of in church, but some of the songs that you've written recently relate, don't they, to specific instances or eras in
Yes, I mean we
society.
hope so. We hope that they are loyal to David's David's writing. I often think that uh, if David arrived in one of our congregations in 2026, he might say, "Look, folks, I'm really flattered you're still using my words, but can you follow my ways as well as using my words?" That he spent his time,
Yeah,
writing about what he saw in front of him. Mark Green often talks about this. He says that 71 out of the 150 Psalms are basically workplace psalms. That we love the idea of David as the king and as the sort of guitar strumming shepherd boy. But what we kind of forget that what he was really good at and what he was famous for was winning battles. He was an incredible soldier. And 71 out of 150 Psalms are him crying out for help in the context of his workplace, in the context of where he is
yeah,
operating. And
yeah.
using the language of the battlefield, using the language of his enemies, using the language, or even when he's in the field, still seeing, whatever animals he's seeing in front of him. So why aren't we writing about what we're seeing in front of us, rather than just retreating to agricultural imagery that actually most folks, especially most young people in our urban context, can't actually relate to? So we're calling people to use 21st century metaphor and 21st century language, so that we can honor the precedent that's set in the Psalms.
Because Psalm 133, behold, how good and pleasant it is when we dwell in unity. You could use that in the workplace, you could use that in the church, you can use that in the world situation, saying it's a really beautiful thing. And perhaps Genesis starts with this sort of kinship, the family helping them, but obviously the famine affected, the whole region, didn't it? And here's a reminder that it's not just about those people that we naturally, if you like, born into or acknowledge are our brothers and
Yes.
sisters. Yeah,
Yes. The bigger challenge is to embrace and interact with those who are not like us.
yeah,
And in the current debates that are going on in our country around immigration, um, I think it would serve us well to be really honest about the fact that we're all a little bit racist, rather than this kind of labeling of saying, "Oh, those folks are being racist and that they're being racist," and I'm not a racist. That puts people in that defensive posture. But all of us, the science shows that they were all innately certainly groupist, and then that socializes into race as we become young children because of the faces that we see. But actually, innately, we want to stick to our tribe, and there's a necessity about that sense of belonging. But we are all inevitably trusting our tribe more. And but if we're honest about the fact that we're all a little bit groupist and we're all a little bit racist, then we realize that becomes a discipleship issue. So just in the same way that we confess that we're all a little bit greedy and we're all a little bit selfish, we have rhythms in our lives, we have disciplines in our church life that actually encourage us into healthier ways of being, encourage us into giving regularly, that encourage us into sharing regularly, that actually sort of take the edge off some of those innate flaws that we know about. So
yeah.
what rhythms have we got in our locality? What rhythms have we got in our local congregation that encourage that are honest about the fact that we have this innate groupism, this innate racism in us, and therefore encourage us into things that will actually step us out to connect with people who are not like us, that might actually do the sort of thing that Rue and I experienced in Northern Ireland, because you grew up not meeting Protestants or not meeting Catholics, depending on which type of school you go to which type of territory you're in. And therefore, some people hit 17, 18 thinking that all Catholics are smelly or all Protestants, or all got different distances between their eyes and they're all out to get them. You believe all the nonsense because the fear and the ignorance and the prejudice grows in the vacuum when people do not connect, when people do not meet. I'll never forget meeting. My music teacher was a wonderful guy called Peter Wilson. And one day I'd seen a thing on the news. I was 17 at this point. I'd seen a thing in the news about about mentioning Roman Catholics in Northern Ireland. And so the next day I went into Peter and I said, Peter, I don't think I've ever met a Catholic. How could I meet some Catholics? And we were part of a prayer group at our school at Portadown College. And I said, could we go and pray with some folks from the Catholic school, the Catholic grammar school, Drumcree High School? And he got in touch with a priest from Drumcree High School, and he set it up. Five of us meeting five of them, and it was like this clandestine meeting. We weren't allowed to tell anybody in this convent because this is back in the early 90s, and back in a convent. On the edge of Portadown, but it was like all smoky and it was really foggy. It was like something out of a movie. It's unbelievable. And the five of us sat opposite five of them, and it was 45 minutes of absolutely getting blood out of a stone. It kind of been my idea. So I dragged four of my friends there, and the other five had obviously been dragged there. And she was saying, so what sort of music do you guys like? No, no connection. What sort of sport do you guys like? No connection. So what do you guys do? Where do you guys hang out? No connection. And we left that meeting thinking, right, oh, this is why Protestants and Catholics never hang out,
Mm.
because like that was really dull and terrible and dry. But
Yeah,
but but but
investing
the
time into.
but what happened is that Peter Wilson stayed in touch with the priest from Drumcree High School. And later that year, he had the idea of getting in touch with the music teacher from the school. And the two of them got together, and they actually, the next year, they formed a choir between the two schools, which is called the Harmony Choir. Cheesy title. But they ended up singing at the Doyle in Dublin, singing for Clinton at the White House. Became this really positive, good news story to come out of Portadown, which at the time was like a hotbed of loyalism and division. So from our like rubbish little acorn, this incredible thing happened. But it took some effort. There was quite a lot of inertia to do that relationship building, to build those relationships, and it took a few false starts before something decent happened. So, sorry, I've got to be in my bonnet about this at the minute. I think,
Yeah,
unless locally we are being intentional about
make the
standing
effort.
against the stuff that, especially with the amount of online nonsense and misinformation that's coming our way, if we are not proactive and intentional about meeting the people who are not like us, then we will inevitably shrink into our own little tribes. And you can see that happening so powerfully and painfully all over the world.
And motivated and empowered. And that's where Psalm 133, it's almost like sacramental, this vision of the oil on the beard and running
Yes.
down Aaron's beard. It's almost, that doesn't show how wonderful the concept of unity over disunity and assumptions is. Uh, we're sort of working our way towards Romans and Matthew, but Psalm 133, does that empower you, Rue?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I find it's really important that word unity there. A bit like Andy was sharing, we in Northern Ireland, we did a lot. My church in particular was really taking a stand to reach out to Catholics and Protestants and to do things together. And one of our church leaders was part of an inter-church prayer group which formed in Belfast and beyond. It grew beyond Belfast as well, which was really seeking transformation in Ireland, and that was done through unity. And it was quite striking in those days when there was so much division in Northern Ireland and in Ireland around religious boundaries, I suppose you could say,
Mm.
that to have any kind of sense of unity was really, it felt quite miraculous. And the way that we did that was by insisting that Psalm 133 was not just some pie in the sky ideal, but was actually something that could be achieved. And that meant that actually we had to sacrifice to gain that unity. It meant that we didn't have to, it meant that we must not imagine that unity was anyway equated with uniformity.
Yeah.
And I think we have, certainly in the United Reformed Church, we have tried to embody that as well. That
Mm.
not everyone thinks the same, and nor do they have to think the same. No one has to look or be the same. It's not about being the same. Actually, we are mindful of the great richness of God's creation and how actually it's the differences between us which enable us to see more of who God is.
Mm.
Because God's creative spark in us is not seen in any one of us, but is seen in all of us as we look and as we kind of understand better how each one works. So that idea of unity was actually a key moment for us and a key
Yeah.
thing to seek as churches together, trying to make an impact in the community, trying to bring
Yeah.
transformation into a very divided community, was not to look for uniformity, and in
Yeah.
fact to
Definitely.
embrace the differences and enjoy the differences, lean into the differences sometimes, because in that we then could start to chip off some of our own ideas, false ideas about how things were, and that grew a sense of unity that none of us expected. We got to a completely different place in the
Mm.
end from where we ever thought we'd be, because we thought in unity we were inviting people to be like us and with us, and actually in unity we got to step into somewhere completely
Yeah.
different, as did everyone else who was there, and it was a much better, richer space as well. So I wonder what our churches can do about that. Have we got a sense of unity within our churches or within the wider community of churches in our area? How do we do that? How do we express that sense of unity without insisting that we have to all be, think,
Yeah.
act the same?
And to allow our people, to, if you like, mess up and make mistakes. I mean, that takes us into Romans 11 in a way. This whole status of Israel and not being rejected because of being disobedient. And it's like a theological lens to say, God's love and mercy extends to the whole of humanity, to Jew and Gentile alike, but not,
Mm.
it's not like totally dependent on one clan or
Yes.
another.
Oh man. And do you know there's a wonderful story to be told about unity that's happening around the UK at the moment in terms of, Eddie mentioned the Gather network that I'm involved with, and also through many of the churches together in England, churches together, Britain and Ireland groups. That churches are actually finding unity in a way that they often didn't previously. You go back 20 years. And most towns and cities, they had their kind of annual unity service because everybody felt a bit guilty and felt like they kind of should do the unity service. But it was, a song to keep that lot happy and a song to keep that lot happy and
Mm,
a bit of liturgy to keep that lot happy. It was very sort of piecemeal and lowest common denominator. But
mm,
um, but those same churches in the last 10, 15, 20 years have actually started running local youth work together, running food banks together, doing prayer on the streets together, doing the most incredible stuff with parents and toddlers, often in coordination. And so unity has been found in mission, where it was
Mm.
always meant to be found in the first place. Of course,
mm,
it's harder to find unity when actually the difference in churches is often based on different ideas and different styles of how we gather and how we do Sunday morning. But actually, the unity's been found in the non-Sunday morning stuff as they've actually done stuff during the week. You look at what we have going on here in terms of work with homelessness from folks, the unity that's been found through churches working together. And combating things like homelessness has been beautiful. And so that unity between churches and often between folks who have no faith at
yeah,
all, or from other faiths, when you're working together on a common cause, those are the relationships that last. Those are the
yeah,
relationships that have some traction. All of us know that from our lives, from old sports teams or from old mission trips. There's something profound about the relationships that are forged in the midst of a mission that will never be forged by just sitting around in a polite circle talking to each other.
yeah. And coming from a place of vulnerability where mercy and love and
Mm,
justice are, if you like, overflowing into the community, into the world, and we find it in place. So it's a slightly different concept from the Joseph model, isn't it? And we definitely see that in Matthew 15, which some people may be concentrating on because of the gospel. seeing the faith of someone who was totally outside. And I know people preparing to preach from that will wrestle through the questions about what it was that Jesus was saying, and how it
Yeah.
seems that Jesus was so harsh. We won't be able to offer anything that they haven't necessarily thought of before now, but it's like seeing where God is at work, and recognizing it. And that seemed to be true for Jesus when she said, even we should be allowed the crumbs from the table. That I'm sure you've read this passage through many times, haven't you?
Yeah, and had it at the General Assembly of the URC a few weeks ago, where we had a visiting preacher was opening the Bible to us each morning, and he'd been asked to think about people who are often ignored in Scripture, kind of some of those characters that we don't hear very much about. And I would guess that the reason why we don't hear very much about the Syrophoenician woman is we don't have much data on her, but also it's a really difficult one to preach on, because in some simple readings of this, it leads us to a terrible conclusion that perhaps Jesus is saying something which is really quite racist. And that just does not float with our understanding of who Jesus is. And I think it's helpful for me when I reflect on this to think about, who's writing this. The writer of Matthew, who's writing it with a particular emphasis. We see it elsewhere in the gospel as well, in the gospels. And I think some people that have preached in my hearing have tried to explain this away. I've seen it even doing research online about this earlier this week as well, trying to suggest perhaps that Jesus is kind of playing with her, that he's using some extreme language to try and get her to make a declaration of faith, as he seems to do in other places in the Gospels. And me many years ago probably would have bought that and would have thought, oh yeah, okay, that's a smart ploy that he's doing. Now I'm not so sure, to be honest. Whenever I revisit this now, it feels strange in my ears, and maybe that's a good thing. It's good for us to challenge and to question these things. I think if Jesus looks exactly like the Jesus that I have in my mind, then I'm not going to be challenged by it. So, but rather than trying to explain it away and try and create some kind of nice, easy answer for this, what the preacher was doing at our General Assembly was he just called it what he thought it was. So he said, that sounds racist. And he moved on to address what the relationship between the two might have been, and then explored what that might mean for us. And I think sometimes to sit with some of these uneasy ideas of how a writer, a gospel writer, has expressed something in a culture, in a time which perhaps had a different impact from what I read now with my lens of this moment, is really something that we do need to sit with and be content to be discontent with it as well. I read this
Yeah.
very carefully, and I think I'd want to explore it very carefully rather than telling people in my church that I think this is a racist phrase. I might encourage them to think for themselves about, is that the kind of language that I'd want to use now? How might that come across? And when do we hear that kind of language being used in contemporary society? And what does that make us feel and think about now? So that's how I would want to gently provoke people with this passage, which is a hugely provocative set of words. If I was writing the gospel, I definitely wouldn't have included this bit. So to sit with the fact that it's there, what are we
Yeah,
going
I
to do
did.
with it?
Yeah, one commentator, I haven't had time to check this, but one commentator argued that this was actually in the whole of that gospel, was the first woman to actually be recorded as speaking.
Hmm.
And her words are calling Jesus Lord and Son of David. And if that is true, there's a sort of a additional thing to what Jesus says to her. Yeah, how about you, Andy?
Well, I love the journey of it. Because we don't think about Jesus growing up very much, even though Jesus was human and he grew up. And so do we work under the presumption that he knew everything that there was to know when he was four? Or when do we decide that happened? When he was 14, when he was 23? I love the sense of our God interacting with us. And him saying quite clearly, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And we know what he means by that, but we know that that's not how the story ends. But then specifically this story ends by him saying, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And to speak to that earlier context when we were talking about immigration and talking about people groups, you know, I love how Jesus is constantly prophetic, constantly
Mm.
challenging, constantly provocative. He is being provocative here. And I wonder if his provocation here is in and around this prophetic speaking well of the faith of somebody else. And you'll remember he also spoke very intentionally well of the faith of the centurion. You also remember that he told the story of the Good Samaritan. What's going on there? He is very intentionally bigging up the faith and the goodness and the made in the image of godness of the other to the people of Israel. So, we sit in a context now when you think of Jesus arriving on Palm Sunday, Hosanna to the Son of David, the palm branches flying. Jesus could have ridden that wave of populism. I think that's a really interesting metaphor for what we're seeing in our day and age. Jesus could have ridden that wave of populism because that crowd really wanted to just get rid of the Romans. They wanted to overthrow their oppressors. They were blaming the Romans in the same way that we blame the others, blame the bankers, blame the immigrants. It's much easier to see the plank in somebody else's eye rather than see the speck in somebody else's eye rather than see the plank in your eye.
Yeah,
Much, much
yeah, yeah.
easier. But as we travel through the Gospels, these folks are going, yes, great. When we get rid of the Romans, we'll be fine. That's great. And then Jesus starts to point out, well, maybe the problem's with us as well. Maybe the axis of evil runs through every human heart, as Solzhenitsyn said. And look at the incredible faith of the Syrophoenician woman, of the Roman centurion, and look at the incredible praxis of the Good Samaritan. And everybody's going, oh, wow. And you're
Yeah,
saying that we've got some stuff to look at as well. That doesn't sound so good. Not sure we like this
yeah.
so much. We kind of like the easy thing where we blame the others, where we blame the immigrants, where we blame we like that better. Actually, can we have Barabbas, please? Can we have the strong man? And
And at the
I
end,
think that story speaks very, very particularly into 2026 that
and
we'd
at the
rather
end of
have the
that
strong man
passage,
that makes us feel
yeah,
safe, the Barabbas, rather than
mhm,
doing the harder yards of examining
yeah.
ourselves as well and realizing that we are at the root of so much of society's ills.
And it's a painful journey to get to the end of the passage where it's clear that not only have bread's been broken, but it's, borders and if you like, a vision for
Mm.
God's grace has been opened, opened up. And we'll wrap up our discussion pretty shortly, but I think it began, didn't it? The other, is it Isaiah 56, it'll keep justice and do righteousness. For soon my salvation will come, my righteousness will be revealed. And here's a sense of something to hold on to in all the difficult sort of parameters, situations, Bible texts, that our God is a God of justice and righteousness.
And a God of responsiveness. Jesus shows in that passage that he is responding to her plea when she said, "No, that is not just. No, that's not
Mm,
right." In the same way
mm,
they saw that happen in the Old Testament, that God responded to challenge. And that's what a beautiful picture of, sometimes paint God as this implacable, untouchable character, when actually he is someone who longs to have a relationship with us. And so it again underlines the need for our liturgy to embrace some challenge and for some provocation. David was impolite. So let's follow the example of this incredible woman
yeah,
and tell
yeah.
God what we want.
Well, that's been a totally fantastic discussion. We've probably raised more questions than we've answered, and that's not a bad thing in politics, in the pulpit. So thank you so much, Andy, for being our guest,
Pleasure.
and to you, Rue, and thank you for listening. I hope this episode has stirred you up and given you some thoughts and some challenge as to how you might address whatever passage you're preaching on in the pulpit or in your worship service. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and do feel free to share this episode with your friends. We also have other online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. This has been a really fascinating discussion. Time just to leave us with one thought out of this. Rue, what's your one thought from our discussion?
I'm thankful for Andy talking about emotions and talking
Yeah,
about how that might be reflected in our liturgy, even on a Sunday morning. How are we going to make
yeah,
space for those natural human emotions in how we
yeah.
understand Scripture and how we explore our relationship with God as well?
And Andy, what's a takeaway that's jumping out at you?
I think the Syrophoenician woman is jumping out at me that that phrase, that even the dogs need food. There is such humility and such power in what she says, and it brings a result and a response from God. And I'm sitting here very challenged as to how often I feel like I do that modern control freak thing where I just control the angles. I kind of have a sense of what God might say yes to and what he might say no to. So I won't ask for the really bold thing. I won't ask for the healing because that would be a bit disappointing if it doesn't happen. But I will ask for the comfort or the peace, or I will ask for the small policy win rather than asking for something spectacular. Um, and I think she has inspired me to just
Okay.
say and cry out and be humble and say, God, no, this needs to change. I'm thinking about the climate stuff. I'm thinking about how it's affecting so many people around the world right now. And we need to, it is an inappropriate posture to not be in tears and not be in lament at what we're seeing and what we've done and how responsible we are. And in the midst of all the discussions about how we mitigate it and the policy discussions, there has to be bucket loads of lament because everybody's feeling it, even if everybody's not honest about it or feeling it out externally. Internally, I believe we're all carrying around an awful lot of guilt and shame and anger, actually, that things haven't changed faster and that we haven't changed faster. And that's only healthy. God's given us this incredible vertical option for our mental health, which is expressing this stuff to him rather than it splurging out in anger to everybody else horizontally. We've got this vertical option uh, that actually blesses us because he's big enough to take it. And I'm just wondering whether we
Well,
should be doing a lot more of that.
thank you so much. That's a powerful and godly way to end our podcast. So thank you and goodbye.